So Republicans claim to be all concerned about child sexual abuse, and then in Tennessee they passed legislation that will allow for child brides. Let's talk about it in today's video. Hi, I'm Mike Greiner. I'm a lifelong Democratic activist who's concerned about the direction our country is taking. I'm also a lawyer and an academic, and I'm here to help you stand up to the BS of the MAGA crowd. Well, I have to start this video by nerding out a little bit. As you know, I'm a professor of law, and so it grates on me a little bit when I see examples of our law being so twisted in a way to serve certain political purposes. The latest example of that was when I saw the legislation that was proposed in Tennessee that aimed to codify the idea that marriage is only lawful when it's between one man and one woman. Now, as we know, the Supreme Court has already ruled on that point in the case Obergefell versus Hodges, a case that actually originated here in my home state of Michigan, applying what is essentially the rule dating back to the 1960s, the Loving v. Virginia case, that said that you have a right to choose who you're going to marry, and the government really can't get involved in that. Well, despite the Supreme Court ruling on that point, the Tennessee legislature has passed a bill that seeks to essentially overturn the Supreme Court's ruling on that. I find it amazing that here they are all excited about the Supreme Court and how it's going to help them in their social policy agenda, but where the Supreme Court stands in the way, well, they'll just ignore it. So this legislation supposedly proposes an alternative form of marriage that they're calling a record of marital contract at common law. Now, again, to start by nerding this out, I'm kind of offended by this because of the fact that it says marriage at common law, and yet it's a piece of legislation. Those two things are incompatible because common law essentially refers to laws that are created by judges. As judges review different cases, they will interpret the law and apply the law. And common law is how the law evolves over time through these decisions. This is in contrast to statutory law, which is where the legislature will pass a piece of legislation. So how can the legislature pass a piece of legislation regarding common law marriage? It doesn't make sense. What's more is traditionally common law marriage was recognized when you had a couple who'd lived together for an extremely long period of time, and their lives had become so intertwined that they may as well have been married for all intents and purposes. Most states have done away with this form of marriage by statute because of the fact that it made more sense when our country was much more rural and there were people who might not have had access to either a judge or a pastor or someone else who was able to actually officially marry them. So this idea of marriage at common law is actually really a misapplication of the term. Now, why does this matter? Some of you may say, oh, it's some law professor just going off about a theoretical legal matter. But it does matter in a way, because the title of this seems to imply a more traditional form of marriage, that this is what's acceptable, as opposed to something that is newfangled or newly created. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time in this video talking about how marriage has changed over the past centuries. So it's not like our current idea of marriage, even when you were to consider it, the marriage of one man and one woman, is very different from the idea of what marriage between one man and one woman was, say, 100 years ago even. Nevertheless, marriage is a constantly evolving institution. And again, coming back to the irony of how this legislation is titled, Obergefell versus Hodges was actually a judicial case where the Supreme Court essentially enunciated a new law. So actually, if you're looking for common law marriage in the United States, common law marriage in the United States is actually gay marriage. But again, we won't let the facts get in the way of a good story if we're conservatives. Now, although Obergefell versus Hodges, when you read its opinion, written by Republican appointee Anthony Kennedy, is filled with flowery language about the sanctity of marriage and how valuable marriage is, and I support all that, by the way. In fact, I find it truly ironic when people who are opposed to gay marriage somehow imply that allowing gay people to marry somehow debases straight marriage. That just doesn't make any sense on its face, because the gay people are trying so hard to get access to the institution of marriage. That in of itself shows that it's a valuable thing, right? Nevertheless, again, let's set that all aside. The actual legal basis for the decision had to do with what's called the full faith and credit clause of the Constitution. Essentially, what that clause says is that actions by one state need to be recognized as valid in every state. So in other words, if the courts in one state make a ruling, then the judgment that is issued by that court needs to be recognized in every state. So in fact, even back when I was in law school, there was talk among the law professors that it was only a matter of time before the Supreme Court ruled that gay marriage was something that should be recognized across the United States, because as one state or another would recognize gay marriage, that marriage in of itself would have to be recognized nationwide. You can't have states suddenly deciding that they're not going to respect the legal actions that get taken by different states. If we do that, then essentially we destroy our union, really. Now, interestingly enough, child marriage was actually fairly common in Tennessee up until relatively recently. Research showed that it was not uncommon for girls as young as 15 or 16 to get married there, and that these marriages frequently resulted in all kinds of problems and abuse, as you can imagine. Well, back in 2018, Tennessee actually passed legislation making it unlawful to get married if you were under 18. Now, the reason critics of this legislation, including myself, are raising the fact that this legislation, in a time that Republicans are claiming Democrats and gay people are all about grooming young people to be sexually abused, that this legislation would allow child brides once again in Tennessee, is that this legislation no longer includes that provision banning the marriage of young people who are less than 18 years old. So technically that is right, that this legislation would allow children to marry again, although I'm pretty sure that's not the intent of this legislation. And really, I wish that we'd focus on what really is the issue here, because the clear intent of this legislation, as stated from the very beginning of the piece of legislation, is that they want to essentially find some way around the Supreme Court ruling in Obergefell versus Hodges that legalized gay marriage. As it turns out, Americans at this point overwhelmingly favor the right of gay people to be married. So why are we as Democrats so afraid of this issue? Why don't we just take it on head on? Make it clear that what Republicans are trying to do, in addition to badly drafting legislation resulting in the possibility of young people again being able to get married, is push their out-of-touch, right-wing social agenda that seeks to deny people rights that most Americans believe should be respected. I think it's high time we stopped cowering from these Republicans and made it clear that this extreme agenda that they're pursuing, both in the states, in Congress when they have the opportunity, and in the Supreme Court, are far out of the mainstream of what most Americans want to see in our country. Well, if you want to see more about how the Supreme Court is pushing this right-wing social agenda, check out this other video that I made here. One of the key battlegrounds for that is abortion, and it'll be interesting to see the way this issue develops as the Supreme Court rules in it in the very near future. I'll see you then. In the meantime, let's hope for continued progress. Thank you.